Jennifer's first word to describe me was consistency. I think it was Bernard Shaw that said that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. I hope that's not where we end up tonight. But we are living in what to me, and I'm going to ask you your view on this, but what to me are very worrying times. In Europe, but not just in Europe, a populism is gaining strength, which is blaming people's diminishing entitlements to housing, to health, to education, to the things that matter to them. It's blaming the diminishing access they have to those on foreigners, on immigrants, on globalization, and on firms that hire foreigners, that invest abroad. And there's a sinister tone that's taking hold in the mainstream of this continent. And I see traces of it in other continents around the world as well. And I don't know about you, but I've been going back to the great works of historians of the 1930s and thinking about what they had to say in a period which was defined by an international financial collapse, a period of people having diminished entitlements and access, a fear and an insecurity, and a rising xenophobia, and thinking very seriously about why, in that context, did established democracies fail? What happened? What tipped democracies over into totalitarian regimes? And of course, some of the markers of that are worrying when we think about politics today. The scholarship that tells us that 3 of the markers of the countries that tipped into totalitarianism were countries in which political leaders failed to condemn political violence, countries in which political leaders failed to respect the civil liberties of their political opponents. Don't start yelling, lock her up. Countries in which political leaders failed to respect the legitimacy of electoral processes. These weren't findings written during the American presidential election campaign. These were findings drawn up 2, 3, 4 decades ago, looking at Europe's experience in the 1930s. And yet, that's what we're now hearing in political debate in many of the countries in which we live. And what's striking to me is that not all parts of the leadership of the public sector and the private sector seem to me to be taking this political change very seriously. It leads me to start tonight by saying, is there really a backlash that we should take seriously or not? Is there a growing chasm between the governed, or those who would like to govern, and those who they would like to govern? So can I start tonight by just asking you, how many of you would share my view that these are very worrying times? That's option 1. And option 2 is that this is an exaggeration of what we're going through, that this is just another blip in a couple of decades of political ups and downs. So how many of option A, as it were, how many think it's worrying times? Okay, I find that really, really interesting, in a curious way heartening, because if I think about the meetings I've had over the last month with the economists advising the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, with the senior officials of international economic institutions, at the Rencontre des économistes français in Aix-en-Provence a week after the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, it seems to me that those groups, and perhaps there's a predominance of economists, and therefore they don't have their ears tuned to the political ground, there is a sense that this is not something that we need to take too seriously, that we just, to quote one of those groups, we just need to remind people that globalization has lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. We just have to assure people that we will manage globalization better, which, of course, leaders of the world have been doing for 30 years. So people are less willing to accept that. They're more conditioned to believe that that's just what they would say, wouldn't they? At the Rencontre des économistes françaises, I kept hearing people saying, we just have to go out into la France profonde and explain the European Union better to people. To which my perplexed reply is, I spend time in different parts of France, and I've never heard the villagers saying, I wish an énarque would come and explain the European Union to me better. That doesn't feel to me like the battle cry. Sitting in Britain during the Brexit referendum, it was very telling that as we got closer to the referendum and people became worried about it, the more global institutions and global experts that piled in to warn of the devastating consequences of a Brexit, the more they persuaded people to vote for Brexit. So as the OECD was wheeled out, the IMF was wheeled out, the Bank for International Settlements was wheeled out, every sort of technocratic organization in the world. And as each of them spoke, including the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, you could hear, it was almost that you could almost hear voters shifting their position in the wrong direction according to what those people were telling them. In other words, they were cementing the views of leavers that if this is the status quo, this is not what we want. We want something different. I'll just grab my water. Thank you. So one scapegoat for the condition that we're in is globalization itself. And what's the argument that says that globalization is killing democracy? There are a number of variations of this argument. You all know the academic debates spawned from the 1980s through about the relationship. But I guess I'd like to focus on the one that American Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis put in the 1930s. I think it anchors us there, where he argued, let me just give you his very famous quote, "We can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. We can't have democracy and a concentration of wealth in the hands of the few." That was his argument, speaking at that time. Should we worry about that? Is there an increasing wealth creation, or concentration? Well, as you all know, yes, there is. In the United States, there's a debate, but the consensus, and around the work of Saez and Zuckman and others, is that the top 1% in the United States now hold almost half the country's wealth. So I'm just talking about wealth here. And that means that the wealth gap in the United States is larger than at any time since the Great Depression. But I think more worrying is its speeding up. The rate at which that gap is increasing is itself accelerating. In the United Kingdom, if we look at the Office for National Statistics, we find that the top decile of wealth holders are increasing their wealth 3 times faster than the bottom 50%. And similarly, in Canada, in Ireland, in Australia, the top 1%'s share of income is increasing with consequences for who holds wealth in those countries. So the first bit of Brandeis's concern is there. Well, there is an increasing wealth concentration in most of the world's established democracies, well beyond the 2 I've given some data for. It's also true that globalization is undoubtedly helping that process, that it's increasing opportunities for business to undertake either financing or production without impediment across borders. So, as the popular narrative would have it, and in fact it's not wrong, globalization is permitting firms to invest wherever either workers are most qualified or wages are lowest or regulation lightest. The profits themselves can then be booked in another jurisdiction, as we saw in the cases of Starbucks and Google and Amazon in the United Kingdom. And the personal compensation which follows from these global transactions can be put into blind trusts, into tax havens, whether it's via Panama or in Delaware or in the Bahamas. The argument about what we should be tracking was put to me very eloquently by a London taxi driver who asked me what I did for a job. And I said, I'm an academic. And he goes, oh, you academics, you don't have a clue. He said, you know, and to my surprise, he didn't know what I was an academic of. I mean, he might, I would have hoped, thought that I was a Shakespeare specialist, but he sort of nailed it. He said, you know, you academics, you study the working class, the middle class, the upper class. You see, totally irrelevant. There are only two classes which matter, he said. It's the super low class and the super upper class, because they're the two classes that don't have to abide by anybody's rules. They're the two classes that don't have any stake in the rules or in how the rules are played. The super wealthy, because they're always immune to those rules, they can act with impunity, and the super poor, because they've got nothing to lose. It's quite a good insight, and it captures part of this popular backlash against a system which means that the Oxford plumber has to pay his taxes, but somehow the world's largest companies don't, which captures the anger in Britain after the financial crisis that the chairman of a failing bank that had lost 24 billion was stripped of his knighthood, whereas a working class man who'd lost £500,000 gambling was put in prison for a few months. It's that sense of injustice which I think is very much a part of this backlash that we're seeing. But that said, if globalization is increasing wealth concentration, does that mean that globalization is killing democracy? The argument I want to put to you tonight is that it doesn't follow, because I think there's something else which is challenging democracy and threatening the democratic institutions which we have, and that has much more to do with politics than with globalization. If you think about the countries I've mentioned, it's not true that all of them are facing a similar strength of backlash, which has to ask us, and it's also not true that globalization is causing the same kind of wealth concentration in all countries. So let's just think about what the backlash is. What is this backlash that is concerning us? Who is this backlash? And because I think everybody is now projecting onto it the story that they might want. It's to do with either race, or it's to do with inequality, or it's to do with specific, economic sectors. So let me just remind you of facts that might have passed you by. If we look at the exit polls on the Trump election, 53% of white male graduates voted for Trump. 52% of white women voted for Trump. Only 43% of white women voted for Secretary Clinton. 47% of white Americans between the age of 18 and 29 voted for Trump. 43% for Clinton. 48% of white college graduates overall voted for Trump. Only 45% of white college graduates overall voted for Clinton. In other words, the depiction that this is the poor of America rising up against the establishment in the United States context just isn't right. As Pippa Norris and her co-author and Engelhardt have shown in the work they've done post the election, there's a closer correlation between demographic and cultural factors and the vote for President-elect Trump than there is for the economics of it. In Britain, the demographics are actually different. It wasn't the young that voted for Brexit, it was the elderly. 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted to remain, whereas only 39% of the over 65-year-olds voted to remain. And similarly, sorry, I shouldn't say similarly. In the Brexit vote, there was definitely a working class leave vote. So if you look at the ABs on the social scale, 57% of them voted to remain. If you look at the C2DE classes, 36% of them voted to remain. In other words, 64% voted to leave. But if you compare workers to the unemployed, workers voted to remain, the unemployed voted to leave. 66% of Brits who live in council housing and cooperative housing voted to leave. And 64% of those with a higher university degree voted to remain. So these demographics, sorry to sort of throw a bunch of figures at you, but I think the point I'm trying to make is let's not overread an economic revolution into this backlash. Because what the figures are telling us is to take seriously, actually, the words that most resonated in the campaigns, which were take back control. And in both Britain and in the United States, it's that sense of taking back control that really powerfully motivated voters who were voting, as it were, against the establishment. So if voters are saying, in a majority, we want to take back control, the next question for us is how then can politicians, can governments give voters a sense of control? And that moves me to the sort of second point that I want to make tonight, which is about direct democracy and the means by which politicians in this context are seeking to give more control to people. We've seen literally a tsunami of referendums across the world, not just in this country, in Colombia on the peace deal, in Hungary over immigrants, in Australia over gay marriage. In the United States, of course, if you voted in the last presidential election, you would have had to vote on 41 referendums, 41 balloted issues. A prominent American economist explained to me that it took him 2 days to wade through the referendums, most of which he didn't have enough information to give a sensible answer to, but which were being put to the whole of the population. Even in my own country of birth, New Zealand, we've had our referendum on which flag people liked the most. I'm going to come back to that referendum. Now, on the face of it, referendums, of course, are a way to give people their say, and hence their popularity with politicians, and to a lesser degree to the populations they're asking these questions on. So why is it that referendums are actually, I would argue, corrosive to democracy as we know it? And there are two reasons. And the first is about how it is that governments connect to and consult with those they govern. Because I think that referendums are part of a kind of seduction by technology that politicians have undergone, where because we know what citizens eat, drink, buy on Amazon, read, we know so much about each individual citizen that there's a sort of sense that if we aggregate all of that information, we can know what citizens want. Big data, in other words, permits us to know our electorate in a way which means we no longer have to use the old-fashioned ways of politics to consult with people. But of course, all of those of you in the room who actually do research on public consultation know at least two things about it. One, ad hoc consultations produce rubbish. You just get people's gut reactions. And two, people need to be organized and to deliberate with one another in order to actually come to understand and know what their preferences are and be able to express them. There's nothing in the click of a button which is permitting people to do that. And yet, politicians before, during, and after these referendums have somehow believed that we can atomize citizens, ask them a question, and make sense of their answer. In fact, the content of the answer is almost meaningless. So let me come back to the New Zealand referendum on a flag. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. Do you like the left-hand one or the right-hand one? Tick the box. You don't have to understand about trade deals, about potential investment flows, about the tech sector. You don't know any of that. You just have to say which one you like. So New Zealand had its referendum on the flag. What's interesting is how difficult it is to find any New Zealander whose vote corresponded to which flag they liked. So why did they place their vote the way they did? Some because the Prime Minister had said he liked that flag, and they either liked him, and so they voted for that one, or they didn't like him, so they voted for the opposite one. Some voted because they didn't like the process of design for the new flag. Some voted because they felt that the committee that decided the shortlist of flag choices was wrong, was flawed. In other words, you got information, but actually it wasn't information, it was a lot of noise. Now, when it comes to votes on these much more complicated issues, the 41 issues balloted in California, the referendum issue here in Italy, it was quite difficult to get people to explain exactly what that referendum question meant. As you know, Google reported on the morning after the Brexit referendum in Britain that the number of people who were Googling what is the European Union, who had voted for Brexit. So the first point is that referendums, if a politician is using a referendum as a way to know what people think, then surely that must be a failed politician, because there are so many ways in a democracy to know what people think or want. If they're resorting to a referendum, you've got to ask why are none of those other ways working, and why are they using the least perfect way possible of finding out what people might want, need, or have a preference for. But the second objection to referendums, to me, is the far more important one and powerful one, which is the word referendum, which means to refer an issue. So why do politicians refer an issue? Typically, politicians refer an issue when it's a difficult one, a decision about which might cost them either their political career or their party unity or their party's duration of time in office. In other words, what the politician is doing is handing responsibility, absolving themselves of responsibility for the decision. That's incredibly dangerous in an elected democracy. You elect politicians to make a decision. If you don't like the decision they make, you can vote them out of office. If instead they refer the decision to the people, who is it that you vote out of office for that decision from which they've absolved themselves of responsibility? And it's for that reason, that latter reason, that Margaret Thatcher described referendums as the tools of dictators and demagogues and not of democrats. And on this issue, I think she's profoundly right, that if you have an elected democracy, you must expect politicians to take responsibility for the decisions they take. If they refer those decisions to the people at large, you can no longer vote out the people who are making those decisions. We can discuss more. That's the first resort that politicians are making to the backlash. The second, which I mentioned at the outset, are the arguments of nativism. I just want to spend a moment on those because I think they're particularly dangerous. They're even more dangerous if you look at the demography of Europe and of other countries around the world. But if we just think about Europe and the fact that if you take Germany, 20% of Germans now have immigrant parents. If you take London, 1/3 of Londoners were born outside of the United Kingdom. If you take France, 10% of the French population are Muslim. So when politicians like the French presidential candidate Sarkozy argue publicly that Muslims who might be suspected of radical tendencies should be imprisoned without judicial authority, we're running roughshod over every part of democracy that's been carefully created as a check and balance. When a British cabinet minister argues publicly that firms in Britain should have to publish lists of foreigners that they're employing in Britain to work for them in order to name and shame people hiring foreigners. We're running roughshod through a country that's proud of being an open trading nation for over 100 years. And we're creating divisions in societies that are already very diverse. So what is it that research tells us about this? If I think of the incredible work done by Miles Houston and a group of psychologists at Oxford, they've carefully tracked what are the conditions in which fear and insecurity rise in societies and create a vicious circle where people become more scared of one another and so mix even less. And when they mix even less, they become even more scared of one another. And it's all in that word mixing. So what their work shows, whether it's Northern Ireland or Malaysia or the north of England, is that the interactions of different groups, minority groups with majority groups, in schools, in community centres, in the political process, in housing, are absolutely crucial to reduce the fear and insecurity that people feel about the other. This is a fact that most of you know, that the least xenophobic of Europe's cities are actually the most diverse, that some of the most xenophobic cities in Europe are actually cities where there aren't any immigrants. There's just a huge fear born of an absence of interaction. But the consequence of that, I think, really requires all of us as academics to pay attention to, because at a time when our societies are becoming more diverse, and at a time when a new populism is emerging, which is creating fear and insecurity across those groups, governments, even mainstream governments, are undertaking policies which further separate schooling, which further separate housing, which further separate the communities, which will only come to reduce that fear by having interaction. And so I think we need to be extraordinarily attentive to all those areas of social policy and national policy which are inadvertently sometimes, but quietly, further separating a society and making it more fertile for the arguments of the new nativists and the new populists. But more than anything else, my argument about the politics, to me, highlights that what's really threatening to democracy is the fact that the organizations through which the people who now want to have their say, used to feel they had a say, have diminished. If we think back to the 1930s again and the British and American experience of the 1930s, it was a time when they built political organizations of participation, mass political parties, trade unions, the ways in which that group of people whose lives were actually getting worse could at least feel that they had a voice in what the future might look like. And yet those institutions have stagnated. It's those institutions that no longer work. They've become marginal, they've become fractionated, they've become just campaign umbrellas. And I'm not putting out a plea that we try to resuscitate dead institutions. I'm saying that what we do need to be engaged in, but with real urgency, is how it is that we're going to renovate and innovate democracy. What are the ways that people are going to come together? And there's some promising strands that I see in research that's being done by scholars as diverse as Leonard Wanchikon, Julian Labonne in the Blavatnik School, and his colleagues, other economists, where they're looking at, for example, the effects of town hall meetings on the way that people are prepared to vote. They're tracking empirically how you can get people to stop voting on personalities and to start voting on political issues if they are informed, if they have a chance in an organized way to come together with information and to deliberate. Even online, we now need to be thinking about how is it that social media, instead of creating narrow echo chambers where people only talk to people that look like them, talk like them, and have the same views, and therefore magnifies and polarizes, to quote the research on the echo chambers that social media are creating. How do we reinvent social media as a place where diverse communities can come together? the head of Infosys was saying to me that when Microsoft first invented Windows, I found this intriguing. It wasn't so that we could all multitask. It was actually because they were thinking about what it would look like to have 6 different views on one issue. So maybe that's where we need to go, to start creatively reinventing. If people are online and interacting, how do we transform those interactions from echo chambers into something that can support the diverse democracies that we live in? So for me, those are the challenges for those in the room who are working on democracy and institutions. But let me just finish with a quick word about globalization and come back to the globalization and the death of democracy. Because I think the way that globalization is managed and governed is really important. It's not alone the cause of this backlash. I think the hollowing out of politics is a big part of the cause of the backlash. But what's been highlighted, if you take the global economy from 2002, when the great financial deregulation really took up pace, and we saw that dizzying period until 2007, when although people's wages were actually stagnating, now that we go back and look at the data, the huge increase in liquidity and debt meant that they could nevertheless go and buy a bigger house. And of course, that party crashed in 2008, when the full scale of indebtedness became clear to everybody, and suddenly the globalization period came to a very sharp pause. If you think of that period in the last 6 months of 2008, the global economy literally nearly came to a stop, with global trade collapsing, with global capital in retreat. But global leaders came together with a growth pact in November 2008, which did restore some confidence and committed governments to actually keeping on spending and stop the global economy seizing up. But by mid-2009, the Greek debt crisis had put a halt to that, because European governments, terrified by the Eurozone crisis, switched very quickly onto a course of austerity as a way to deal with the post-2008 mess. And that austerity, on top of the bust in liquidity, has cast huge numbers of people into very much harsher circumstances. And those people in those harsh circumstances are now saying, hold on, we want governments to protect us from this. I want my government to offer protection that when I walk down the road I don't get attacked, to offer me protection that my children will go to school, and that if I get sick, I'll be protected, that I will have some chance of a job, even if I don't have a job, and that my children will have a chance of a job. It's very interesting to me that for the electorate, the idea that the government might be protective is a positive word, and yet in the world that I spoke of at the beginning, of the G20, of the IMF, of the French economists meeting, protectionism is a filthy word, right? It's the word of the dinosaurs. And that gap has to be bridged. And it has to be bridged not by a simple return to what the economists would call protectionism, but by a real rebalancing of what it is that governments can do to balance the rights and responsibilities of firms, of governments, and of citizens. And quietly, the last 2 decades have seen that eaten away. We've all seen clearly what happened in global finance, where the imbalance between financial investment opportunities and the responsibilities that those investing had to take became clear in 2008, when I think actually President Sarkozy at the time put it beautifully when he said, why is it that in these large banks, when they make huge profits, they have these profit share systems, and they say, gosh, you had such a role to play in these profits that you're going to get a bonus of $10 million. Your role was slightly less, so you're going to get $5 million. And your role was yet less, you'll get $2 million. And as to those guys there, they're going to get 10,000 each. And yet when that same bank went bust, they said, we can't possibly hold anyone to account. We don't have a clue who was responsible for that. And of course, the bill came in all of these countries onto the public sector. So we saw it there, but what we didn't see, I think, quietly, was the inroads that have been made in private investment law, in private investment treaties on governments across Europe, across emerging Europe, and across developing countries, where bilateral investment treaties have put huge constraints on what governments can actually do. In one case that my Oxford colleague Vaughan Lowe acted in and then wrote about, a government was being held, in essence, to ransom for wanting to introduce welfare policies, which a firm was arguing went against the investment treaty provision that the government could not undertake policies which would infringe on the company's profits. Once you're there, as he wrote about a decade ago, the balance between rights and responsibilities has gone horribly out of balance. The arbitration decisions around those investment treaties started stripping governments of a broader sovereignty, not just upholding the rule of law in terms of investor rights. So in these ways, I think they're just two examples of the way that globalization has proceeded as an opening up of opportunities, and what has been absolutely not done, what's the unfinished business, is the globalization of responsibilities. If you're a global bank and you're investing globally, the same regulations that ensure that you're not reckless at home should, of course, apply internationally. If you're an oil company and in your own country you're subject to regulations which ensure that you don't damage the environment, those same regulations should surely apply to you globally. If you've now got freedom to invest globally, if you're a global producer, for the same reasons that you pay tax at home when you produce at home, you should be paying tax to the countries in which you're producing because you're relying on the system that tax pays for. These are absolutely common sense propositions. But in the globalization that we've seen over the last 20 years, there has not been any globalization of responsibilities. There's simply been a globalization of opportunities. And that comes back to governments. That comes back to governments signing agreements, creating institutions that have pushed that agenda and not then agreeing to cooperate on tax cooperation, on regulatory cooperation, on global financial regulation. So I think, just to finish my comments, I don't think globalization's killing democracy, but I think that globalization needs to be now hugely balanced. It's up to governments now to ensure that they actually have regulation that matches responsibilities to opportunities at the global level if they're not going to create conditions which are hostile to democracy. But if we really are worried about democracy, let's remember Juan Lintz's lesson about the 1930s when he said that democracies fell not because of the strength of populist parties, but because of the weakness of democratic parties and of Democrats to stand up and protect their own institutions, protect the rule of law, protect civil liberties, protect the constitutional order that balanced power in their own systems. It was the weakness of Democrats, not the strength of populists. I think that's a really important lesson for us all in these times. Thank you very much.